Hi, in this webinar, I'm going to discuss the key points about feeding suckler cows during the breeding period and early pregnancy. My name's Emily Simcock. I'm a veterinary surgeon and I work for Nordis as a veterinary advisor. Nutrition and feeding are really crucial to fertility and overall productivity in suckler cows. Small changes here can make a really big difference. When breeding goes well, there are more calves born for the same number of cows, but there are other benefits too. For block calving herds, having a tight calving period is really important. It helps with management, particularly feeding the cows correctly, and it reduces the time indoors for diseases to build up. The stock bull is also out before he can serve any early born heifers. But the most significant effects are having a uniform crop of calves at weaning time, either to sell, to fatten, or to keep as breeding heifers. For all year-round calvers, poor fertility can go unnoticed, but getting the feeding right will help to keep the calving interval down. Maximising fertility also reduces the number of cows culled as barreners. Energy is by far the most important part of the diet to get right. The amount of energy available to the cow and consequently the amount of her own body fat reserve she'll need to use will have a significant effect on the time it takes to recover from calving and start cycling, and also affects the quality of the eggs she's ovulating. The most important time to get body condition right is in the run up to calving, and the condition the cow calves in at is going to have the greatest influence over that period from calving to conception. The nutrition for beef cows before and after calving is covered in another Nordis webinar by Sam Cottam, and I would encourage you to have a look at that too. But it is really important not to undo all that hard work around the calving period by letting the cows lose weight in the run up to breeding. The condition loss must be kept to less than half a score, or about 5% of body weight. If she's losing lots of body fat and using it for energy, the chemicals in her circulation will inhibit fertility. Spring calving cows on the whole should be maintaining condition if they calved in at target. This is essential if they were fed to have a controlled level of condition loss in winter to save feed costs. The timing of calving should ensure plentiful grazing to meet the cow's energy needs for maintenance and for lactation. If spring is delayed, then forage reserves or supplementary feeding are going to be needed to provide this instead. The dry cow ration is not going to be sufficient. For autumn calvers on the whole, they will calve in at a slightly higher condition than spring calvers after a summer of grazing. Some condition loss in early lactation is okay, but it mustn't be more than half a score. If they had a great summer and calved in too fat, then it's really important that they don't lose excessive condition at this time. The early dry period will be the correct time to sort this out, not early lactation. For heifers in either system, it's really important to get them calving in at the right condition and then feed them appropriately after calving for maintenance, for lactation, and also for heifers to continue to grow. In suckler cows, energy requirements right up until the last couple of weeks of pregnancy are not dramatic, but after calving, the needs for energy for lactation increase significantly. For a milky cow, the requirement for energy can be double that of her dry period needs. So a 650 kilogram cow, and bear in mind that many cows are now much larger than this, needs about 120 to 130 megajoules of energy per day. This compares to about 75 to 85 megajoules per day in the dry period, but this can vary enormously with yield and with fat content of the milk. Beware those really milky Friesian cross suckler cows. So a lactating cow will be able to eat about 2% of her body weight. So 13, maybe up to 16 kilograms of dry matter intake per day is possible. If we divide this by the megajoule requirements of the cow, it will tell us the energy density of the ration should be above 10 megajoules, around that, per kilogram of dry matter. The intakes are going to vary with appetite, with the type of feed provided, and also by the way it's presented. In general, cows will eat less of a dry, high fibre forage like straw or hay, and more of a higher quality, lower fibre forage like good grass silage. But bear in mind that the intakes are hugely influenced by palatability and also by access. Managing grazing in a scientific way is not something readily done by most beef farmers, but it's so important and can make a huge difference to energy and protein intakes. The young grass shoots before a stiff seed head forms can have the highest energy content of any forage. At 13 to 14 megajoules, it's really easy for grazing alone to meet the energy needs of a big suckler cow producing even as much as 15 litres of milk. But poor grazing that's run to seed can be much lower in energy, and those swards that are very low to the ground will be really difficult for the cows to get high intakes. Managing the grazing and moving the cows frequently to ensure the grass height is correct will keep the nutrient value really high and maximise the regrowth. There are lots of excellent resources about grazing management, and plate meters are not expensive to get these grassland measurements accurate. But as a rule of thumb, grazing the sward between mid-welly height and ankle bone height is a good guide. If the grass has got head and seeded, either take it away for silage, top it off, or let it grow on for standing hay or making hay later, or leave it for other groups of animals. For early spring calvers that calve indoors or need to be fed outdoors, and for autumn calvers after housing, the ration does need a little more thought. We calculated earlier that the energy density of the diet should be above 10 megajoules. Hay is usually about 7.5 or 8, so it's clearly not sufficient alone. Grass silage can vary hugely, with a poor forage being 8.5 and a good one 11.5. These girls don't need rocket fuel, but they do need decent silage. The essential message is analyse your forage and set any supplementary feeding up with advice. There's loads of ways to feed beef cows indoors using all sorts of forages, straights and co-products, but the take-home message is that a suitable dry cow ration will not provide enough energy for a lactating cow, and low quality forages will need balanced supplementation. Most important of all is to ensure that cows can access the feed, it's palatable, and there's plentiful water access too. Protein requirements for lactating suckler cows are relatively modest unless they're really heavy milkers. The overall crude protein of the ration should be 10 to 12%. The type of protein doesn't really matter too much because the requirements for nitrogen sources to allow the rumen bugs to grow, or effective rumen degradable protein, or ERDP. The protein in grass and in most decent grass silages will be just fine. Where supplementation is required, some sources from urea are acceptable. The ERDP is there allowing the rumen to function, which in turn will feed the cow with her energy requirements. For straw-based rations and for hay, supplements will require a decent level of crude protein, and they need to be rationed with advice. Co-products like wheat distillers and pot ale syrup contain good sources of ERDP, and straights like rapeseed, peas, sunflowers, for example, can be used. Soya shouldn't be necessary, and compound suckler nuts are also an option. Magnesium is the most important macromineral to supplement. Lactating cows on lush pasture are most at risk of deficiency. There's a Nardis webinar on grass staggers to look at. Extra magnesium can go into the water, providing it's the only source. Licks and buckets are a really easy way to supplement cows at grass too. For lush grazing, particularly in wet or cold conditions, it's worthwhile providing a bale of hay or some stemmy silage to slow the rumen transit time down and allow the magnesium to be absorbed. Mineral deficiencies or trace element deficiencies are often blamed for poor fertility when the real problem lay with energy nutrition in the run-up to calving or in early lactation. However, correct provision of trace elements is really important for fertility. Copper and selenium in particular will impact fertility performance. A recent UK study analysed copper levels in more than 500 cull cows at slaughter. Of these, 77 were beef breeds. And while the study showed that much of the UK dairy herd is excessively supplemented with copper, the results also showed that more than half of the beef animals in the study had low liver copper levels. Extensively grazed cattle are at risk of mineral deficiency, as are animals that are fed on an unmineralised straw, maize or hay-based ration. It's really important to supplement trace elements correctly with advice. There are lots of ways to provide supplementation. For cows on indoor rations, mineralising the feed through the nuts with blend or direct sprinkling of powdered minerals onto the feed as possible. For grazing animals, boluses are an effective way to ensure every cow gets the correct amount of minerals. Licks and blocks are easy and relatively cheap way to provide trace elements, but the intakes can vary. Be wary not to supplement by multiple sources, and it's important to discuss the appropriate approaches to mineralisation as part of your herd health plan. So in summary, getting the body condition right in the run-up to calving is the most important. In the breeding period and early pregnancy, maintain the body condition or minimise the loss to less than half a score using well-managed grazing or with analysed rations. Magnesium deficiency is the biggest macro mineral risk, and magnesium has got to be supplemented through the feed, through the water, or using licks or blocks. You need to meet trace element requirements with not too much and not too little. Take advice and use a method that's appropriate for the herd situation. There's lots of resources on beef herd fertility on the Nardis website, A to Z for cattle. Thanks very much for listening.